The Missouri River was a different beast in the pre-dawn chill of a Montana autumn. It wasn't the lazy, sun-drenched ribbon of summer. It was a steely, gray artery, its surface breathing a low-lying mist that clung to the cottonwoods lining its banks. This was the quiet I had paid for, the silence I had driven 2,000 miles to find. My small, half-renovated cabin stood as a lone sentinel on a bluff overlooking a bend in the water, a fortress of solitude against a world that had grown too loud. Each morning started the same. Coffee, black and bitter, brewed on a propane stove that hissed in the otherwise silent kitchen. Then, boots on, jacket zipped against the bite in the air, I'd walk the game trail down to the river's edge. It was a ritual, a grounding. The rhythmic crunch of my boots on the gravelly path, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the vast, indifferent sky stretching overhead. It was a liturgy of forgetting. Forgetting the sterile white of hospital walls, the frantic beeping of machines, the final, deafening silence that followed. That morning, the silence was broken. It wasn't the cry of a hawk or the rustle of a deer in the underbrush. It was something smaller, thinner, a fretful sound, almost lost in the steady murmur of the current. I stopped, head cocked, listening. It came again, a wavering cry that snagged on the cold air. It sounded distressingly human. My heart, a sluggish muscle these last few years, gave a painful lurch. People didn't come out here. Tourists stuck to the main roads, and the nearest ranch was 5 miles away. I moved faster, my boots slipping on the slick, rounded stones of the shoreline. The sound grew stronger, guiding me around a thicket of willows. And then I saw it. It wasn't a wounded animal. It was a bundle. A dark, lumpy shape tucked into a hollow between two large pieces of driftwood, sheltered from the direct path of the water, but exposed to the elements. It was wrapped in something thick and coarse, a hide, dark brown and matted. Buffalo, my mind supplied, a strange and archaic detail that felt jarringly out of place. The crying was coming from inside. For a moment, I was paralyzed. My mind raced through a Rolodex of impossibilities. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not to me. The world I had so carefully constructed, a world of wood, stone, and water, was being breached. Taking a shaky breath, I knelt. The air smelled of wet fur and cold river mud. My hands, clumsy with a sudden tremor, reached for the bundle. The hide was stiff and heavy, smelling faintly of wood smoke and something else, something animal and wild. I peeled back a flap. Inside, nestled in what looked like a worn wool blanket, was a face. Tiny, pale, and streaked with tears. A baby. Her eyes were closed, her small mouth open in a continuous, desperate cry. She couldn't have been more than a year old, if that. Her skin was cold to the touch, a deep, alarming cold that spoke of long hours spent in the damp air. Who would do this? The question was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. What kind of person leaves a child by a river to die? My own past grief, a sleeping dragon, stirred in my chest. I didn't think, I acted. My movements became sure, driven by a primal instinct I thought I had buried. I scooped the bundle into my arms, the weight of it both terrifying and achingly familiar. The baby was so light, too light. As I drew her against my chest, trying to shield her with my body and share my warmth, the crying stopped. It ceased so abruptly it was like a switch had been flipped. Her little body went still, and for a heart-stopping second, I feared the worst. But then, her eyes opened. They weren't the unfocused, milky eyes of a newborn. They were a deep, clear gray, and they looked directly at me with a startling awareness. There was a flicker of something in them, not fear, but a weary, ancient knowledge that had no place in a child's face. The silence stretched, broken only by the river's flow and my own ragged breathing. I held her closer, my chin resting on the top of her head, which was covered in a sparse fuzz of dark hair. Her skin still felt like ice. And then it happened. It wasn't a sound, not really. It was more a vibration, a breathy exhalation that traveled from her small chest directly into mine. A whisper, so faint it was more felt than heard. A wisp of air against my shirt, forming words that my mind struggled to accept. They're still out there. I froze, my blood turning to slush in my veins. It was impossible. A baby this young couldn't form words, let alone a coherent sentence. It had to be the wind, the sibilant rush of the river. My own mind, fractured by shock and grief, playing tricks on me. I looked down at her. Her eyes were still open, fixed on my face. Her expression was placid, unreadable. There was no sign she had uttered a sound, but I heard it. I felt it. The words echoed in the hollow space of my skull, a chilling premonition that twisted the peaceful landscape into something menacing. The rustling leaves were no longer just leaves. The shadows between the trees were no longer empty. The vast, open space that had been my sanctuary now felt like a stage, and I was suddenly, terrifyingly visible. They're still out there. Who was still out there? The people who left her? The thought sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through me. I scanned the opposite bank, the tree line, the bluffs upstream. Nothing, just the raw, empty wilderness. But it didn't feel empty anymore. Panic overrode disbelief. I clutched the baby tighter and turned, scrambling back up the trail toward my cabin. Every snap of a twig, every call of a distant bird, sounded like a footstep, a signal. The wind whispering through the pines seemed to carry the echo of that tiny, impossible voice. The cabin, my fortress, seemed miles away. When I finally burst through the door, slamming it shut and throwing the deadbolt, my lungs were burning. I leaned against the wood, heart hammering against my ribs. The baby in my arms was silent, her eyes now closed, a faint flush of warmth beginning to creep back into her cheeks. I had to call someone. The sheriff, an ambulance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the river itself was now a witness, and that it had started to whisper back. The heavy oak door of the cabin slammed shut, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. For a moment, the only sound was the frantic hammering of my own heart against my ribs. The baby in my arms, who had been a bundle of piercing cries just moments before, was now unnervingly still. She wasn't asleep. I could feel the slight, tense shiver running through her tiny body. I carried her over to the worn leather couch, my movements stiff and clumsy, as if I were handling unexploded ordnance. The cold from her small frame seeped through my jacket, a damp chill that had nothing to do with the river. My first coherent thought was a practical one: warmth. I gently laid her down on the cushions, her dark eyes wide and fixed on my face with an unnerving intensity. I moved to the cast iron wood stove, my hands shaking as I grabbed the poker and stoked the embers back to life. I added 2 more logs, welcoming the crackle and pop that broke the sterile quiet. The fire was a primal comfort, a small rebellion against the cold that seemed to emanate from the baby herself. Her wrappings, the buffalo hide, were soaked at the edges. I knew I had to get her out of them. Kneeling on the floorboards, I carefully began to unwrap her. The hide was heavier than it looked, smelling of wet earth, the river's murky scent, and something else. A faint, wild musk that was both ancient and deeply unsettling. I ran my hands over its surface, expecting to find a brand, a tag, some clue to its origin. There was nothing. It was just a raw, primitive blanket, a relic from another time. I folded it carefully and set it on the stone hearth, a piece of evidence I didn't yet understand. Underneath, the baby wore a simple, thin cotton onesie, now damp and useless against the cold. Her skin was a pale, mottled pink. She couldn't be more than a year old. I rushed to my bedroom and pulled out my softest flannel shirt, a faded red plaid garment that had seen better days. It was ridiculously large for her, but it was warm and dry. As I wrapped her in it, she let out a soft whimper, a fragile sound that was achingly normal. It was a relief after the impossible whisper. I checked her limbs, her head, her torso, searching for any sign of injury, but found only the profound vulnerability of an infant left to the elements. But the whisper wouldn't leave me. They're still out there. It coiled in my mind like a snake. I looked down at her, at the innocent, unformed face. A baby that sighs can't talk. They make sounds, they cry, they babble. They don't form coherent, terrifying sentences. It had to be a hallucination, my trauma-riddled mind playing tricks on me, amplified by the adrenaline of the situation. The wind whistling through the pines, the rush of the river, my brain must have stitched the sounds together into something familiar. It was the only logical explanation. And yet, the feeling was absolute. The certainty of it was a physical weight in my gut. I walked to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The Montana landscape, my chosen sanctuary, was now a canvas of threats. The dark expanse of the forest, the jagged peaks in the distance, the gray, churning surface of the river, it all seemed to be hiding something. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague paranoia. It was a piercing, active surveillance. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I was a recluse, not a parent. Keeping her here was not only illegal but dangerous for her. My isolation, once a shield, was now a cage. I dug through a drawer and pulled out my satellite phone, a lifeline I rarely used. My fingers felt thick and clumsy as I punched in 9-1. The connection crackled before a calm, professional voice answered. Chowdo County 911, what's your emergency? My own voice was a strained croak. I found a child, a baby. I gave my location, the coordinates I had long since memorized. She was by the river. She's cold, but I think she's okay. I have her in my cabin. I stopped myself there. I couldn't tell them about the whisper. They would think I was a lunatic, maybe even a suspect. The story was bizarre enough, without adding a talking baby to it. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably just over an hour before I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel track leading to my cabin. A white and green county sheriff SUV pulled to a stop. A man in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered with a face weathered by years of Montana sun and wind, stepped out. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried calm that I immediately found both reassuring and intimidating. He knocked once. "Sheriff Thompson," he said through the door. "Mr. Miller." I opened it and he stepped inside, his sharp eyes taking in the entire scene in a single sweep. Me, looking like a cornered animal. The baby, now dozing fitfully on the couch, cocooned in my flannel shirt. And the dark, strange shape of the buffalo hide on the hearth. "Thank you for coming, Sheriff," I said. "Let's have a look at our little Jane Doe," he said, his voice a low baritone. He knelt by the couch, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he checked her breathing and felt her temperature. "Seems stable for now, but she needs to get to the hospital. Where did you find her?" I recounted the story, pointing out the window towards the stretch of riverbank. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. He then walked over to the hearth and picked up the buffalo hide, weighing it in his hands. "Haven't seen one of these used for anything in a long time," he mused, more to himself than to me. "No tags, no markings." He looked at me. "Any idea where it came from?" "No, it was just there, wrapped around her." The sheriff's procedural calm was cracking my composure. He was treating this like a lost wallet, not like the impossibly strange event it was. The need to be heard, to be believed, overwhelmed my rational fear of sounding insane. "Sheriff," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "There's something else. And I know how this is going to sound." He turned his full attention to me, his gaze steady. "Go on." When I picked her up from the ground, she stopped crying, and she said something. I heard it clear as day. She whispered. I took a breath. She whispered, "They're still out there." The silence that followed was deafening. Sheriff Thompson's expression didn't change, not a twitch, but I saw it in his eyes, a flicker of professional reevaluation. The way a man looks at a situation when a new, unpredictable variable has just been introduced. He wasn't looking at a hero anymore. He was looking at a witness who was potentially unreliable. "Son," he said, his voice softened with a practiced, patronizing tone. "You've had a major shock. Adrenaline is pumping. The wind in these hills can play tricks on a man's ears. It's easy for the mind to fill in the gaps with something that sounds like words." "It wasn't the wind," I insisted, my voice rising with desperation. "I heard her." He gave a slight, non-committal nod, a gesture that dismissed my reality without arguing with it. He pulled out his radio and called for medical to meet them down at the highway junction. He told me they'd take the baby to Fort Benton, get her checked out. He carefully placed the buffalo hide into a large evidence bag. "We'll look into it, mister." "Miller," he said as he prepared to leave, the baby bundled securely in his arms. "We'll check missing persons reports, talk to folks at the reservation. We appreciate what you did here today. We'll be in touch." The door closed, and the sound of his SUV driving away faded into the vast Montana quiet. I was alone again. The cabin, once my fortress, now felt like a stage. The baby was gone, but her mystery lingered. A toxic presence that had taken root in the floorboards and in the deepest corners of my mind. The silence she left behind was louder than any cry, filled with one impossible, terrifying question. The silence in the cabin was a physical weight. After Sheriff Thompson's cruiser crunched its way down the gravel drive and faded into the vast indifference of the Montana landscape, the quiet rushed back in, heavier and more menacing than before. It was the silence of a space that had briefly held life and now held only its ghost. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, the scent of wood smoke and damp wool mingling with the faint, phantom smell of baby powder he'd used. His hands felt empty, his arms ached with a memory of the small weight they'd carried. He replayed the conversation with Thompson over and over. The sheriff's face, a mask of professional patience, barely concealed the skepticism in his eyes. "The wind plays tricks out here, son, and you've been through a shock." The words were meant to be calming, a rational explanation to soothe a rattled mind. To Ethan, they were a dismissal, a branding. He was the crazy guy from the city, the one who hears things, the unreliable narrator of his own life. The label stung, reigniting old embers of frustration and helplessness he thought he'd buried out here. Paranoia, once a creeping vine at the edge of his consciousness, now began to strangle him. Every creak of the cabin's old timbers was a footstep outside. A branch scraping against the roof was the sound of fingers clawing for a hold. He found himself circling the small space, checking the lock on the door for the third time, peering through the window into the gathering dusk. The setting sun painted the undersides of the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange, but the beauty was lost on him. He saw only lengthening shadows, perfect cover for anyone or anything that might be watching. They're still out there. The baby's impossible whisper was no longer just a memory. It was the cabin's new mantra, echoing in the oppressive quiet. It was either real or he was losing his mind. And if Sheriff Thompson's reaction was any indication, the world had already made its choice for him. "No," Ethan muttered, his voice hoarse. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't be the hysterical victim. He needed answers, not for the sheriff, but for himself. He needed to prove he wasn't crazy. The key, he realized, was the buffalo hide. It wasn't just a random blanket. The way it was wrapped around the child, the sheer weight and age of it, it felt deliberate, ceremonial. Thompson had taken it, logged it into evidence bag number 734, another sterile piece of a puzzle he had no interest in solving. But Ethan had held it. He remembered the feel of the coarse hair, the smooth, worn leather on the inside, the faint, earthy smell of sage and something else, something metallic and old. He strode over to his laptop, the dim glow of the screen pushing back against the encroaching darkness. His fingers flew across the keyboard, clumsy at first, then more certain. He started with broad searches. Abandoned baby Montana, Missouri River child. The results were a useless flood of news articles about parental negligence, tragic accidents, and Amber Alerts from other states. Nothing matched. He tried to be more specific, focusing on the one element that made this different. Baby wrapped in buffalo hide, Montana. The results shifted. Now he was in the realm of history and tourism. Sites selling replica hides, blog posts about the Lewis and Clark expedition, articles on the cultural significance of the American bison to Plains tribes. It was all interesting, but it was academic. It didn't have the chilling immediacy of his experience. Frustration mounted. He was chasing a ghost on the internet, while the real threat could be lurking just beyond his window pane. He stood up, paced to the window again, and saw nothing but his own haunted reflection staring back. He had to think. What was he missing? The whisper. the hide, the river. These were the elements. He sat back down, typing in a new combination of words, a shot in the dark. Montana Folklore River Child Buffalo. This time, something different appeared. Buried on the second page of results was a link to a low-tech forum, a simple, text-based website with a dated design called Rockies Unsolved. The forum's banner was a grainy photo of a mountain peak at dusk. The threads had titles like The Vanishing Hiker of the Beartooths and Strange Lights over Flathead Lake. It was a digital campfire for conspiracy theorists and local lore enthusiasts, a place where a story like his might not be immediately dismissed. He scrolled through the posts, a mix of ghost stories and UFO sightings. Most of it was easily dismissible, but then he found it. A post from 3 years ago titled Echoes of the Hydrapt. The author, a user named Sage Runner, described a story his grandfather used to tell, a local legend from the Missouri River Breaks area about children being found near the water under strange circumstances. Sometimes they were wrapped in animal pelts, always appearing after a long, harsh winter. The legend was vague, fragmented, but it spoke of a community that lived between the lines, one that kept to itself and had its own ancient laws. The post didn't have many replies. A few users called it a fascinating piece of folklore. Another suggested it was a misremembered history of early settlers or a forgotten tribal custom. But Sage Runner's tone was different. He didn't present it as fiction. He presented it as a piece of a larger, hidden history. He wrote with a quiet authority that cut through the noise of the other posts. His profile listed his location simply as where the mountains meet the plains. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. This was more than the wind playing tricks. With trembling hands, he created a new, anonymous account, user River Walker 7. He debated for a full 10 minutes what to write, how much to say. Revealing everything would make him sound like another internet crank. Saying too little might get him ignored. He settled on a message that was both guarded and desperate. He opened a private message to Sage Runner. Subject: a question about your Hydrapt post hello. I came across your post from a few years ago. I'm a researcher looking into obscure Montana folklore, specifically stories from the Missouri River Breaks area. Your mention of children found wrapped in hides is very specific. I was wondering if you had any more information on that legend or where it might have originated. Any detail, no matter how small, would be helpful. Thank you. He hit send. The word message sent appeared on the screen. And then there was only silence again. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was still filled with fear, but it was also laced with a fragile, terrifying thread of anticipation. He had cast a message into the digital wilderness, hoping a stranger, a user named after a plant and a traveler, held the key. Ethan closed the laptop, the darkness of the cabin absolute. He was still alone, but for the first time since he'd heard that whisper, he felt a flicker of hope that he wasn't the only one who knew something was out there. The hours after sending the message were a special kind of hell. Ethan paced the worn floorboards of his cabin, a caged animal in a zoo of his own making. Every creak of the old wood, every rustle of leaves outside was a potential footstep, a sign they were coming for him. The silence between these sounds was worse, a hollow void where his imagination ran rampant. He'd check his phone every few minutes, the blank screen a silent accusation. He was a fool. He'd reached out into the digital ether and expected a lifeline, but all he'd found was more emptiness. Maybe Sheriff Thompson was right. Maybe the whisper was just the wind, the hide just a strange piece of trash, and the whole thing a product of a mind already frayed by trauma. He was making coffee for the 10th time, the bitter aroma doing nothing to soothe his shot nerves, when his phone buzzed on the counter. The sound was so sharp and sudden in the quiet cabin that he flinched, sloshing hot liquid over his hand. Cursing, he ran his hand under the cold tap, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was a notification from the forum. His breath caught in his throat. For a long moment, he just stared at the device, a small black mirror reflecting his own pale, haunted face. Fear and a desperate, agonizing hope warred within him. With a trembling thumb, he unlocked the screen. The message was short, devoid of any digital pleasantries. Sage Runner, you saw it too. The hide. The child. Don't talk about this online again. Too many ears. If you want answers, meet me. Bighorn Cafe off Highway 191 tomorrow at noon. Come alone. Delete this message. Ethan read it once, then twice. A cold wave of validation washed over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He wasn't crazy. You saw it too. The words were an anchor in his storm of paranoia. But the relief was immediately chased by a new, colder fear. Come alone. This could be a trap. Who was this person? One of them luring him out into the open, but what was the alternative? To stay here, to let the fear consume him, to never know. The memory of the baby's impossible whisper echoed in his mind. He had to know. He typed a one-word reply, okay. Then, as instructed, he deleted the entire exchange. The next morning, the drive to the Bighorn Cafe was a 40-mile trip through purgatory. The majestic peaks of the Absarokas, usually a source of solace, now seemed to watch him with cold indifference. Every pickup truck that appeared in his rearview mirror was a potential tail. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles were white, his eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. He felt exposed, vulnerable, a man willingly walking into a predator's den. The Bighorn Cafe was exactly what he expected. A low-slung building with a faded sign depicting a majestic ram. A few dusty trucks were parked out front. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of fried bacon and stale coffee. A couple of old-timers in seed caps sat at the counter, murmuring to the waitress. In a booth by the window, a lone woman sat, nursing a cup of tea. She looked to be in her late 60s, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled back in a neat braid. Her face was a roadmap of dignified lines, her dark eyes sharp and intelligent. She met his gaze as he entered, and with a subtle nod, indicated the seat opposite her. This was Sage Runner. Ethan slid into the cracked vinyl booth, his heart thudding. She wasn't what he expected. There was no wild-eyed conspiracy theorist here, only a calm, grounded presence that was both disarming and intimidating. "Ethan," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was low and steady. "I'm Alara. How do you know my name?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. This is a small part of the world. A man living alone in the old Miller cabin who calls the sheriff about a baby by the river word gets around. Especially when some of us are listening for it. She took a slow sip of her tea, her eyes never leaving his. "Tell me what you saw, everything." Haltingly at first, then with a torrent of pent-up fear and confusion, Ethan told her. He described the cry, the meticulously wrapped bundle, the impossible cold of the baby's skin, the intricate markings on the hide. When he got to the whisper, he braced himself for the same skepticism he'd received from Thompson. Instead, Alara just nodded slowly, her expression unchanged. "They're still out there," she repeated softly. Yes, that is what she would say. "So you believe me?" Ethan asked, the words catching in his throat. "I have no reason not to," Alara said simply. "I've been waiting to hear a story like yours for a very long time. That hide you found, it belongs to the people of the long winter. That's what my ancestors called them. They are not a legend, Ethan. They are a community, a family of sorts. One that broke away from my people, from the Crow, generations ago. They rejected the reservations, the treaties, everything. They chose to live as ghosts, hidden in the harshest corners of these mountains, following traditions so old and severe that most have forgotten them." Ethan stared at her, trying to process the information. They weren't monsters or spirits, they were people. "Why would they leave a baby by the river?" he asked. "That is the question," Alara said, leaning forward slightly. "They are reclusive, but they are not needlessly cruel. Every member is essential for survival. To abandon a child, it means something is wrong. Either the child was cast out for a reason we can't understand, or she was being saved from something within the community itself." She paused, her gaze turning distant. "My great-aunt disappeared when she was a young woman, almost 80 years ago. The stories say she ran away to join them. We never knew for sure. I've spent my life collecting the whispers, the fragments of stories like hers, like yours. The sheriff, he just dismissed me. He took the hide and told me I was in shock. Elara gave a humorless smile. Sheriff Thompson is a practical man. He knows, as his father the sheriff before him knew, that some doors are best left unopened. The people of the long winter do not have borders you can patrol or laws you can enforce. They melt back into the wilderness. Stirring them up causes more trouble than ignoring them. For him, one baby in Child Protective Services is a far cleaner file than an investigation into a ghost clan living in the mountains. A waitress came by and refilled Ethan's coffee without him asking. He wrapped his cold hands around the warm mug, the simple gesture a small comfort in a world that had just been irrevocably fractured. "What do I do now?" he asked, looking at Elara, his first and only ally. Her expression hardened slightly, a deep seriousness settling in her eyes. "First, you understand that you are no longer invisible to them. By finding that child, you have crossed a threshold. They will be watching. They will want to know who you are, what you know, and what you plan to do. Do not go looking for them. Let me make some quiet inquiries through channels that Thompson doesn't have." "And you," she said, her voice dropping to an intense, cautionary tone, "you need to be more careful than you have ever been in your life. The quiet you came to Montana seeking is over." The drive back to the cabin was a surreal torment. The familiar curves of the two-lane highway, flanked by endless stretches of pine and rock, no longer felt like a gateway to sanctuary. Every shadow stretching across the asphalt seemed to harbor a silent watcher. Elara's words had acted like a developer in a darkroom, bringing a terrifying image into sharp focus where before there had only been a formless negative of paranoia. The fear was no longer a ghost whispering in his mind. It was a passenger in the seat beside him, cold and solid and real. He turned onto the gravel road leading to his property, the truck's tires crunching a sound that seemed deafeningly loud in the late afternoon stillness. He killed the engine 100 yards from the cabin, letting the truck coast to a silent stop. The quiet he had once craved now felt heavy, pregnant with unvoiced threats. His eyes scanned the tree line, the porch, the windows of his small home. Everything looked the same, untouched. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him deeper than the Montana air, that the appearance of peace was a lie. He got out of the truck, leaving the door open. The metallic click of the latch closing felt like it would be a summons. He walked slowly, his boots scuffing softly on the dirt path. His gaze swept over the woodpile, the rain barrel, the small shed where he kept his tools. Everything was in its place. He felt a flicker of absurd disappointment, a feeling immediately squashed by a fresh wave of dread. Did he want to find proof? Then he saw it. It was so small, so insignificant, he almost missed it. His hand axe. The one with the worn hickory handle and the nick in the blade from a misplaced swing last fall. He had used it this morning to split kindling and had left it, as he always did, blade down in the large oak stump he used as a chopping block. It was his routine, a mindless muscle memory habit. The axe was not in the stump. It was resting on the porch railing, laid perfectly parallel to the weathered wood, the blade facing the cabin door. It wasn't dropped, it wasn't forgotten. It was placed, deliberately. Ethan's breath hitched. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. They hadn't broken anything. They hadn't stolen anything. They had simply moved a single object to let him know they could. "We were here. We can get this close. We can touch your things. We can touch you." The message was as clear as if it had been scrawled on his door. He backed away slowly, his eyes locked on the axe. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline. He didn't call the sheriff. What would he say? That someone moved his axe. Thompson would laugh him off the phone. There was only one person who would understand. He found Elara's number, which she'd scribbled on a napkin from the diner, and pressed call. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos raging inside him. "Ethan, I was hoping you would call. You made it home safely." It wasn't a question. "They were here, Elara," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. He walked back toward his truck, putting the vehicle between himself and the cabin. They were at my cabin. They moved my axe. They left it on the porch railing. There was a moment of silence on the other end, but it wasn't the silence of disbelief. It was the quiet of grim confirmation. "A signal," she said softly. "They are not hunters, Ethan. They are ghosts. They know the land. They wanted you to know they are watching. Does it look like anything was taken?" "No, nothing." "That's what makes it worse." He leaned against the cool metal of the truck's fender, the dense forest seeming to press in on all sides. "What do they want?" "I have been making inquiries," Alara said, her tone shifting, becoming more focused. "Through channels that Deputy Thompson does not have. The hide the child was wrapped in, the symbols painted on it with the red ochre were not just decoration. They represent a specific family line within the people, the line of the Stone Benders." Stone Benders. Ethan repeated, the name sounding archaic and strange. An old name for a family known for their stubbornness, but also their foresight. "My grandmother used to say they could see the cracks in the world before the rest of us felt the earthquake," Alara explained. "And I have heard something else, a whisper on the wind. There is a fracture within the community, a deep disagreement between the elders and a younger generation." Ethan listened, captivated, the fear momentarily pushed aside by intrigue. "What kind of disagreement?" "The elders wish to maintain their isolation at all costs. They believe any contact with our world will be the end of them, a dilution of their blood and their ways. But the young ones, they see the challenges. Sickness that their old medicines cannot cure, winters that grow harsher. They believe that slow death is no better than assimilation. They argue that some connection, some careful exchange is necessary for survival." A sudden, chilling realization dawned on Ethan. "The baby," he breathed. "Leaving the baby wasn't an act of cruelty." "No," Alara confirmed. "I believe it was an act of desperation. A message in a bottle cast into the river. A plea for help from a faction that is losing a war for its future. They didn't abandon her, Ethan. They sent her to us. They sent her to you. They chose you." The weight of her words settled on him. He wasn't just a random bystander who had stumbled upon a secret. He was a participant, an unwilling one, but a participant nonetheless. The people watching him from the woods might not all be hostile. Some of them might be terrified, hoping he would understand their silent plea. As twilight began to bleed through the trees, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, a flicker of movement at the edge of his property caught his eye. It was at the far end of the clearing, near the dense wall of pines that marked the beginning of true wilderness. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a coyote. It was upright, a fleeting, man-shaped silhouette that vanished as quickly as it appeared. His blood ran cold. They were still here, watching. "Ethan, are you still there?" Alara's voice was a tinny sound from a world away. He couldn't speak for a moment, his throat tight. He swallowed hard. "I'm here," he finally managed to say, his gaze still fixed on the spot where the figure had been. "Alara, what do I do now?" The world narrowed to the rectangle of the window and the silhouette standing motionless within it. A choked sound, a gasp for air that wouldn't come, escaped Ethan's throat. His knuckles were white where he gripped the phone, the plastic groaning under the pressure. The figure didn't move. It wasn't a trick of the light or a shadow playing games. It was solid, still, and utterly terrifying in its quiet confidence. "Ethan, Ethan, what is it? What do you see?" Alara's voice, sharp with concern, crackled through the earpiece, a thin lifeline in the suffocating silence of his cabin. "There's someone out there," he whispered, his voice trembling so badly the words were barely coherent. "By the trees, they're just watching." He expected her to sound surprised, maybe even panicked. Instead, her tone became steel. "Listen to me very carefully. Do not hang up. Do you have a weapon in your hand?" "No," he stammered, looking at the hunting rifle mounted over the fireplace. The thought of grabbing it was a primal urge, a scream of self-preservation in his mind. "Good. Do not pick it up. Do not make any sudden movements. They have been watching you for hours, maybe longer. If they wanted to harm you, you'd already be hurt. This is not an attack. It's an observation." Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. An observation. Ilara, there's a person standing 20 yards from my window in the middle of the night. I know, and you are going to show them you are not a threat, she commanded, her voice a low, steady anchor. Move slowly. Go to the window and pull the blinds. Not quickly. Do it like you're tired, like it's the end of any normal day. Then do the same for the other windows. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to barricade the door. But Ilara's certainty cut through the fear. She understood these people. He didn't. He had to trust her. Taking a shaky breath, he forced his rigid muscles to move. He walked to the window, his eyes locked on the figure. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought it raised a hand, but he couldn't be sure. His hand trembled as he reached for the cord. With a slow, deliberate pull, the blinds rattled down, shutting out the night and the watcher. He was plunged into the artificial warmth of his cabin, but the feeling of being exposed was more intense than ever. He moved through the small space like a man underwater, his movements sluggish and heavy. He drew the curtains on the kitchen window, then checked the lock on the front door, his fingers fumbling with the deadbolt. It was already locked. He locked it again, as if the redundant click could build another layer of safety. He turned off all the main lights, leaving only a small lamp burning in the corner, casting long, dancing shadows that turned familiar objects into monstrous shapes. Okay, he whispered into the phone, his back pressed against the solid wood of the door. It's done. Now you wait, Ethan, Ilara said. They are testing your temperament. Your city dweller panic is what they expect. Show them something else. Show them stillness. Brew some coffee, sit in your chair, but do not go to sleep. Stay awake until the sun comes up. Waiting was the hardest part. The cabin, once his sanctuary of peace, had become a pressure cooker. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind whistling through the eaves, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through him. He made coffee, his hands shaking so much he spilled grounds on the counter. The familiar, rich aroma did little to soothe him. He sat in his worn armchair, facing the front door, the phone still pressed to his ear. Ilara stayed on the line, her silence a comforting presence. Occasionally, she would murmur something about the people, not their legends, but their character. They value patience above all things, she said quietly after an hour had crawled by. They live by the seasons, not the clock. To them, a night of watching is nothing. It's a conversation without words. Ethan tried to understand. He pictured the baby's face, the impossible, desperate whisper. He was connected to this now. This wasn't just a strange event. It was a responsibility he had stumbled into by the riverbank. The fear began to slowly recede, replaced by a weary resolve. He wasn't just a victim hiding in his cabin. He was a participant in a silent, high-stakes negotiation. Hours bled into one another. The moon tracked its slow path across the sky, its light filtering faintly through the edges of the blinds. The coffee grew cold. His muscles ached from the tension. Just as the first hint of gray light began to soften the edges of the window frames, Ilara spoke again. When the sun is fully up, I want you to open your door. But before you do, look through the peephole. Tell me if you see anything on your porch. What would I be looking for? A message, she said simply. A question. He waited until the darkness outside had fully retreated, replaced by the cool, crisp light of a Montana dawn. The world felt new and clean, a stark contrast to the stale, fear-soaked air in his cabin. He crept to the door, his heart beginning to pound again. He put his eye to the peephole, the tiny fisheye lens distorting his front porch. It was empty, mostly. Right in the center of the welcome mat, placed with undeniable purpose, was a small object. It was a single, dark feather, a raven's feather, he guessed, tied to a small piece of smoothed river driftwood with a thin strip of sinew. It was simple, stark, and clearly man-made. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a weapon. It was something else. There's something here, he said into the phone, his voice hoarse from a night of disuse. He described it to Ilara in detail. A long silence followed on her end. When she finally spoke, her voice was grave. It's what I feared, and what I hoped for. "What is it? What does it mean?" "It's not a threat, Ethan. It's an invitation," she replied. "The driftwood is from the river where you found her. The raven feather in their traditions, the raven is a messenger, a creature that exists between the worlds of light and shadow. They are asking you a question." "What question?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the simple, profound object on his porch. "They're asking whose side you're on." The phone felt cold against Ethan's ear, a stark contrast to the warmth of the rising sun that now streamed through his window, illuminating the raven feather on his table. "A question," Alara's voice repeated, calm and certain. "They're not threatening you, Ethan. They're asking where you stand. The river brought you their child. The woods are watching to see what you will send back." "Send back? What am I supposed to do, wave a white flag?" Ethan's voice was strained, the sleepless night etched into every word. His eyes kept flicking to the tree line, expecting to see a shadow detach itself from the pines. "Nothing so simple," Alara said. "Words are wind, actions have weight. They showed you their history with the buffalo hide, their sorrow with the feather. You must show them your intent, something of your own, something that says you are a man of peace, a provider, not a taker." Ethan looked around his sparse cabin. It was a monument to detachment, filled with things that were functional but held no meaning. He had come here to empty his life, not to fill it with connections. What could he possibly offer? His gaze landed on a small duffel bag in the corner, the one he hadn't fully unpacked in over a year. Inside was the life he'd run from. He knelt and unzipped it. On top lay a worn, leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with his handwriting from a time before Montana, a time of noise and crowds, and a pain he thought he'd never outrun. He flipped to the very back, where a dozen blank pages remained. A new story. He then remembered the small, unopened can of infant formula he had bought in a panic that first day. He had shoved it in a cupboard, a painful reminder of his helplessness. He knew what he had to do. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear, but with a strange, terrifying sense of purpose. He thanked Alara, his voice thick with emotion, and hung up. With the sun climbing higher, casting long shadows across the valley, Ethan walked back to the Missouri River. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and pine. He went to the exact spot where he'd found the baby, a small clearing of smooth, gray stones near the water's edge. He gently placed the journal on the flattest stone, opening it to a blank page. Beside it, he set the can of formula. It was a clumsy offering, a mix of the symbolic and the practical, but it was all he had. It was an answer. He lingered for only a moment, the cold wind whipping at his jacket, then turned and walked back to his cabin without looking back, an act of trust he didn't know he was capable of. The day bled into a long, quiet afternoon. The silence in the cabin was different now, not empty, but expectant. Ethan didn't pace or stare out the windows. He sat at his table, drank coffee, and waited. He had given his answer. The next move was theirs. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, a figure emerged from the woods. It wasn't a fleeting shadow this time, but a man, tall and lean, who stepped deliberately into the clearing of Ethan's property. He wore practical, dark clothing and moved with a quiet confidence that was anything but threatening. He stopped 100 feet from the cabin and simply waited, his gaze fixed on the door. He wasn't an aggressor, he was an emissary. Taking a deep breath, Ethan opened the door and stepped outside. The cold air was a shock. The man gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and turned, gesturing for Ethan to follow. There was no discussion. The time for symbols was over. Ethan followed him back down the familiar path to the river. As they neared the clearing, another figure came into view. A woman, holding a baby wrapped snugly in hides. The baby from the river. She was awake, her dark eyes wide and curious in the fading light. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Seeing her safe, warm, and with her mother, released a tension in his chest he hadn't realized he was holding. The man spoke, his voice low and steady. "I am Kale. This is my wife Anya, and our daughter Lyra." Anya looked at Ethan, her expression a mixture of profound gratitude and lingering fear. "We saw what you left," she said softly. "The book for a new story, the food for our child." Is she okay?" Ethan asked, his gaze fixed on the little girl. "Her fever is down for now," Kale answered. "But it will return. It always does. It's a sickness in the lungs we have no name for and no medicine to fight." And there, by the rushing water of the Missouri, the full story came out. They were the people of the long winter, and their leader, an elder named Silas, ruled with a conviction that any contact with the outside world would mean the end of their people. He forbade modern medicine, modern tools, modern knowledge, believing their ways were the only thing keeping them pure. But the purity was killing them. Children were dying from treatable infections. Desperation was fracturing their community. "Our daughter was getting weaker," Anya explained, her voice trembling as she held Lyra tighter. "The elders said it was a test of faith. We saw it as a death sentence. We chose to have faith in something else." "We watched you for days," Kale added. "We saw you were alone. We saw the quiet in you. We took a risk. The only one we had left." Suddenly, the whisper made sense. "The whisper," Ethan said, looking at Anya. "They're still out there. That was you." Anya nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I was hidden in the reeds just across the water. Silas's men were searching for us. I saw them coming down the ridge just as you picked her up. It was a warning, for you and for her." It was never a supernatural event. It was the desperate, wind-carried whisper of a terrified mother. The realization settled everything into a stark, human clarity. "What do you need?" Ethan asked. The question came from a place deeper than thought. It was the end of his escape, the beginning of his purpose. Kale met his eyes, his gaze unwavering. "We don't need a savior. We need a bridge. A way to get medicine for Lyra and for the other children without Silas knowing. A contact. Someone we can trust in a world we don't understand." Ethan looked at the family before him, Kale's stoic resolve, Anya's fierce love, Lyra's innocent stare. He saw their impossible choice. He thought of his own empty, self-imposed isolation, and saw it for the cowardice it was. He had come to Montana to find peace from the world's problems, only to discover that true peace wasn't found in hiding, but in facing them. Here, on the banks of a cold river, was a problem that mattered. He gave a slow, definitive nod. "Okay," one word. It wasn't a promise to fix everything. It was a commitment to try. It was the first page in the new story. Anya let out a shuddering breath of relief, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. Kale's shoulders, rigid with tension, relaxed slightly. In the twilight, the four of them, a broken family and a man who was finally whole, stood together, a fragile alliance against the encroaching darkness. Their work was just beginning.